Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your source materials and, well, we plunge them into the deep end. We're here to extract those knowledge nuggets you need to be truly well-informed.
And today, we are strapping in for, I think, one of the most astonishing periods of geopolitical transformation in really all of history.
It's an incredible story. We're looking at the Ottoman Empire in a window of just 64 years, a tiny slice of time, from 1453 to 1517.
Yeah, that time frame is just, it's staggering. It's less than an average lifespan today, but within it, the Ottoman state goes through a complete metamorphosis. I mean, it's a total reinvention.
They go from being a major regional power, a big player in Anatolia and the Balkans, to something else entirely.
Something else entirely. They synthesize themselves into a universal empire. Suddenly, they're controlling the three critical hinges of the world: the Eastern Mediterranean, the major trade routes in the Middle East, and, of course, the most important religious sites in Islam.
It's just a dizzying rate of acceleration. And our sources for today really show how this systematic and, let's be honest, often brutal imperial ambition was achieved. And it was achieved through the specific and very contrasting contributions of just three sultans.
Right. And to map this dramatic change for you, the listener, we're going to use a kind of structural analogy throughout our discussion today. Think of it as building a grand, world-dominating enterprise.
Okay, I like that. So let's lay it out. Who's our first figure in this analogy?
First up is Sultan Mehmed II, reigning from 1453 to 1481. He was the architect. He's the one who seizes the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet. Constantinople designs the revolutionary blueprint for the state and lays down all the new legal foundations.
Okay, the architect. Then following him, we have his son, Bayezid II. He's on the throne from 1481 to 1512.
And Bayezid, he's a site manager. He isn't flashy, he's cautious. He spends decades consolidating the foundations his father built, dealing with internal cracks, patching things up, and integrating these new vital economic components into the structure. He's all about long-term stability.
Right, securing the project. And that brings us to the grand finale of this period, Selim I. His reign is incredibly short, just 1512 to 1517.
And he is the industrial tycoon. He walks onto the scene, rips up the regional ceiling, accelerates the whole timeline, and doubles the scale of the operation in 5 years flat. And on top of all that, he buys the ultimate non-negotiable brand recognition, the Caliphate.
A huge amount of ground to cover. We have to start at the beginning in 1453 with the architect.
We do.
So let's jump right into that blueprint. Part 1. Mehmed II, the architect of the imperial synthesis, the fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453. It's just a monumental event. But the sources are clear. The significance goes way beyond just a military victory, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You have to understand, this city had stood for over 1,000 years as the heart of the Roman Empire in the East. It was the city. So by taking it, Mehmed II wasn't just acquiring territory. He was acquiring history, symbolism, and a direct claim to universal sovereignty.
And he broadcasts that claim immediately, not just by moving the capital there and renaming it Istanbul, though we should probably note that formally the Ottomans often still called it Sinai for a long time.
That's right. But the real statement was in the titles he adopted. The most striking one, the one that sent shockwaves through Europe, was Kayser-i Rome.
Caesar of Rome.
Caesar of Rome.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the implications of that for a moment. This puts him in direct competition with the Western powers, especially the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope. He's not just the Sultan of the Ottomans anymore. In his own mind and in his public declarations, he's the legitimate successor to Caesar and Constantine.
That's the moment the whole psychology shifts.
It is. It's the moment the Ottoman state stops seeing itself as just a regional entity and starts seeing itself as a true world empire.
But there's a problem. That's a massive declaration, but the sources are very clear on this. The city was a ruin. It was a shell of its former self. Functionally, it was useless as a capital for this new universal empire. So how did Mehmed, the architect, start laying the physical foundation?
He acted aggressively and very systematically. Our sources detail this policy called sürgün. It translates to forced resettlement or exile. He knew he needed manpower, skills, economic diversity, and he needed it fast. So he ordered thousands of families, sometimes entire neighborhoods, to be forcibly moved from towns in both Anatolia and the Balkans straight into Istanbul.
So this wasn't just about making an attractive offer. This was compulsory diversification.
It was. But, it was also paired with a lot of pragmatism. At the same time, he sent out invitations to the surviving Greek, Armenian, and Jewish populations who had either fled or been displaced. He guaranteed them houses. He guaranteed them religious autonomy.
So his vision was a kind of controlled diversity.
A controlled diversity, exactly. A city of many faiths, many peoples, but all of them serving the central state power. This ensured that Istanbul's population boomed almost overnight, creating the base he needed for the huge court and administrative structure he was about to build.
And the sources mention these massive public works projects he started. This physical architecture was just as important as the legal architecture he was designing.
Absolutely. You see this most clearly with Topkapi Palace. The construction, which ran from about 1465 to 1478, created something entirely new. It wasn't just a royal home, it was a self-contained administrative city.
Right, because before this, the sultans were more mobile, weren't they? Moving between Bursa and Edirne.
Exactly. The court was more fluid. Topkapi formalized this rigid, centralized court administration that we now associate with the High Ottoman period. It concentrated the entire machinery of governance. The Divan, which was the Council of State, the Treasury, the Janissaries' quarters, the harem, everything was in one secure, highly controlled location.
And at the same time, he creates this massive engine of consumption and trade.
Yes, the Grand Bazaar, the Sarsi. Mehmed commissioned this very early on. And by forcing all the trade and artisanal production into this massive centralized hub, he made sure the state could efficiently tax it, regulate it, and of course benefit from the vast flow of goods. The bazaar became the pulsating economic heart that was needed to fund his armies and his grand ambitions.
It's an entire ecosystem he's building from the ground up.
A complete ecosystem. And we even see early signs of that famous Ottoman court culture here. He sponsored these massive public festivals for dynastic events, like circumcisions of princes, which, doubled as commercial showcases and a way to display imperial wealth and power to the masses.
So you build a massive new administrative city. You need an equally massive legal framework to hold it all together. And this brings us to the Kanun, which is where the architect really stamps his revolutionary blueprint onto the empire.
The Kanun, the Book of Law, is critical. It codified the dynastic law, and in doing so, it formally united two very distinct legal traditions. You had Islamic law, the Sharia, which is based on the Quran and Hadith. That governed religious life, family matters, property for Muslims.
But then you had the other side of it.
Right. Then you had Sultanic law, which was called Kanun or Urf. And this was essentially the ruler's prerogative. This was administrative law, financial law, criminal law, all designed for the smooth running of the state itself.
So he was, in effect, formalizing a separation of powers, a separation between the state's political administration and its religious institutions.
Precisely. The Sultan was the ultimate legislator when it came to Kanun. And by codifying this, by putting it in writing, Mehmed was confirming that the political needs of the empire often provided a parallel track to, and sometimes even trumped, the strict dictates of religious scholarship. It was a huge step in centralizing absolute power in the Sultan's hands, rather than sharing it with the ulema, the religious scholars.
And within this new legal architecture, we find what is maybe the most chilling provision of all: the law of survival. Institutionalized royal fratricide.
This is where the sheer ruthlessness of the architect is laid bare. The source material shows that Ottoman history leading up to Mehmed was just plagued by civil wars between princely rivals. The most disastrous was after Bayezid I's defeat in 1402, which led to a decade-long interregnum where the state nearly collapsed entirely.
So Mehmed looked at that history and decided the survival of the unified centralized state was the highest possible moral good.
It was the only thing that mattered. And the only way he saw to guarantee that unity was to eliminate all potential rivals the second a new sultan took the throne.
And he wrote it down as law?
He did. The Kanun name enshrined the policy. The quote is famous: "Any of my sons that ascends the throne may rightly kill his brothers to preserve the order of the world." I mean, it's an incredibly cold, pragmatic calculation.
It's brutal, but the logic is to prevent the much greater economic and human cost of a protracted civil war.
That's the justification. Even if it meant authorizing the swift, horrific execution of the Sultan's own siblings, his own children, it stabilizes the dynasty at the ultimate personal cost. And this legal mandate becomes a defining feature of this new imperial order he's building.
So alongside managing the Muslim population through law, he immediately has to figure out what to do with the massive non-Muslim populations, Christians, Jews, now under his direct rule, especially in his new capital.
Right. And here he established the foundations of what would later be known as the Millet system. The whole idea was to integrate these diverse peoples while maintaining firm political control.
And his first big move was with the Orthodox Christian community.
It was. He appointed a man named Gennadios Scholarius, who was a staunch anti-unionist, meaning he opposed unifying the Orthodox Church with Rome as the new Orthodox Patriarch. And in doing so, he effectively gave the Christian population the power to manage their own internal religious and social affairs. They became a self-governing community, but one that operated under the protection and ultimate authority of the Sultan.
So you grant this internal autonomy, but you maintain state control and you ensure their economic utility through this thing called dhimmi status.
That's the balance, exactly. Non-Muslims, Jews, and Christians were recognized as people of the book and granted protection, or dhimma. This included the right to worship, own property, practice their trades. It was a framework for coexistence.
But it was a framework with very clear stipulations that mark their subordinate status in the state hierarchy.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are very specific about what this meant in practice. First, they were required to pay the jizya, a poll tax levied specifically on non-Muslims. It was a constant financial reminder of their status.
And there were social limitations, too.
Strict social limitations. They were forbidden from carrying weapons. They couldn't ride horseback, which was a major status symbol of the ruling class. There were even architectural rules, like ensuring their homes couldn't physically overlook the homes of Muslims. It was an explicit system of structured inequality, designed to maintain Muslim hegemony while allowing these economically vital minorities to function and, crucially, contribute to the imperial treasury.
With the state's legal and institutional architecture secured, Mehmed the architect turns his focus outward. He's not content with just blueprints. He needs more land for his empire.
The expansion was just relentless. Once Istanbul was secure, his focus swung immediately to the Balkan sweep. In this incredibly rapid succession, the Ottomans conquered Serbia in 1459, then Morea, which was the last little Byzantine remnant in Greece, in 1460, and then Bosnia in 1463. This solidified Ottoman control over much of Southeast Europe.
Though it wasn't all easy, the sources mention some pretty legendary resistance.
No, absolutely not. The resistance was heavy, particularly in Albania. It was led by the famous figure Skanderbeg, and he complicated total Ottoman dominion there for many, many years. Skanderbeg became a symbol of Christian resistance across Europe, and it just demonstrates that the Balkan conquest, while fast, required an immense and sustained military commitment.
And while all this is happening in the West, he has to secure his rear in Anatolia against some very powerful rivals. Who is the main threat there?
The main threat was the Akoyunlu Turkmens, under their leader Uzun Hasan. They were the chief rivals for dominance in Anatolia. Mehmed knew he couldn't fully project power westward while this potent, independent force was sitting on his eastern flank.
So he had to deal with them decisively.
And he did. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Otlukbeli in 1473. And this is a great example of the new Ottoman way of war. Mehmed's centralized Janissary infantry armed with firearms and his use of artillery just crushed the traditional Turkmen light cavalry. This victory was instrumental. It cemented Ottoman authority across the Anatolian heartland and secured the core of the empire.
And the culmination of this whole universal ambition, this claim to be Roman emperor, it comes right at the very end of his life. And it shows that the Kayser-i room title was not just for show.
The Otranto landing in 1480. This is an incredible moment. Mehmed's forces landed in southern Italy. And this move just sent waves of panic across Europe. It wasn't a raid. It was a clear sign of his intention to press his claim to the Western Roman legacy. He was effectively threatening Rome itself and the papacy.
This audacious move into the heart of Western Europe.
It was, and it was only abandoned because of his sudden death in 1481. His death immediately forced the army to return and, of course, plunged the empire straight into a succession crisis.
What an incredible legacy for the architect. He gives the empire its centralized capital, its foundational law, its ruthlessly efficient method of succession, and a huge chunk of new territory. But his death throws everything into chaos. Which brings us to part 2. Bayezid II, the cautious site manager.
And Bayezid's reign, which spans from 1481 to 1512, is so often overlooked. It lacks the dramatic conquests of his father and his son, but it was absolutely essential for consolidation. He inherited a structure that was still politically very unstable, primarily because of the immediate crisis involving his brother, Sultan.
Right, the shadow of civil war. A direct consequence of that Kinu name that hadn't quite been fully enforced yet in this first transition.
Exactly. The succession was disputed. And Sultan, after he was defeated in the initial battles, did something critical. He fled west, First the Knights of St. John on the island of Rhodes, and then eventually he ended up in the custody of the Pope in Rome.
And that turns Kim from just a domestic rival into a massive international political liability.
The ultimate political puppet. The sources show the political extortion was just relentless. The Pope, first Innocent VIII, and later the notorious Borgia Pope Alexander VI, they essentially kept Sultan as an insurance policy. He was a captive, ready to be unleashed at any moment to spark a devastating civil war back in Anatolia if the Ottomans got too aggressive in the West.
So Bayezid was essentially being blackmailed.
He was. He was forced to pay these enormous annual stipends, often tens of thousands of gold ducats, to the various people holding Kenom just to keep him safely locked up and out of circulation.
That's a massive financial drain, but the political cost must have been even higher.
Undeniably. It meant Bayezid could not, under any circumstances, replicate his father's aggressive westward expansion. His whole focus had to shift to defensive fortification in the Balkans. He couldn't risk a major campaign into Central Europe or Italy, while his brother remained this ticking time bomb in the hands of the Pope. So this crisis, it really consumed the first half of his reign, and it's what defines him as the site manager. He's stabilizing the political foundation, not expanding the structure.
So if he was stalled politically in the West, he turned his focus inward to strengthening the internal economic structure. And the sources detail one of the most fascinating examples of this, the expulsion of Sephardic Jews from Spain in 1492.
This was a strategic masterstroke, really, disguised as an act of tolerance. Following the Spanish Inquisition and the Alhambra Decree by Ferdinand and Isabella, thousands upon thousands of Jewish families, the Sephardic Jews, were expelled from Spain. And Bayezid famously saw this as a foolish move by Spain. There's a quote attributed to him where he says, "You call Ferdinand a wise king who impoverishes his own country and enriches mine."
So this was far more than just offering refuge. This was an intentional acquisition of highly valuable human capital.
Absolutely. These were not poor refugees. They were often highly skilled merchants, artisans, physicians, and crucially, they were financiers and printers. They brought new technologies. Bayezid welcomed them and strategically resettled them across the major urban centers of the empire: Istanbul, Edirne, and most notably, the city of Salonika.
And Salonika became, for all intents and purposes, a Jewish city, didn't it?
It did. The sources estimate the community there swelled to nearly 30,000 people, and it included distinct groups from Aragon, Castile, and Portugal. And they brought with them these advanced techniques, especially in the woolen industry. And this wasn't just decorative wealth. This was crucial for state logistics.
Right. So tell us about that direct link. How did their skills actually benefit the Ottoman military machine?
Well, they revolutionized textile production. The Sephardic Jews used imported techniques to process wool and dye cloth. They supplied not only the luxurious fabrics for the imperial palace, but most critically, they provided the Ottoman army with much of the high-quality cloth they needed for uniforms and blankets.
Yeah.
So this integration solidified the state's logistical backbone. It just proves that Bayezid's consolidation efforts were fundamentally about building economic power and resilience.
So even with this more cautious approach to conquest, he was still maintaining military quality. And we see this focus on excellence even in something like his dedication to the art of archery.
That's a great point. His father, Mehmed, had started the custom of setting aside a dedicated archery field in Istanbul. Bayezid expanded it significantly. The sources describe how he granted special privileges to archers. You have to remember, archery was more than a sport. It was a core military skill, essential for light cavalry and the elite corps.
And he also supported the industry around it.
He did. He protected the roughly 500 specialized craftsmen who manufactured the bows, arrows, and other equipment, even granting them prime commercial space near the palace. It shows this deep commitment to maintaining military readiness and technological superiority, even during a period of less external aggression.
And despite his caution on land, which was forced on him by the Siam crisis, the sources show that Bayezid was actually quite assertive at sea. What was the strategic goal of his naval expansion?
The goal was to secure the trade routes and assert dominance over the key access points to the Balkans. And the primary antagonist at sea was, of course, Venice, the traditional maritime power in the region. Bayezid invested heavily in the Ottoman Navy, and this investment paid off decisively.
We see a couple of major naval victories mentioned.
Yes. The Ottoman fleet, led by an admiral named Kemal Reis, delivered these crushing blows to the Venetian forces at the Battle of Zonchio in 1499, and then again at the Battle of Modon in 1500. These victories were pivotal. They significantly reduced Venetian influence in the Aegean, and they solidified Ottoman control over crucial coastal areas like Albania and Montenegro. Bayezid made sure that while land expansion was on pause, Ottoman maritime supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean was firmly established.
So as the site manager's reign winds down, the focus shifts dramatically. It moves away from the West, away from the lingering Khimim crisis, which had finally resolved itself with Kino's death, and it turns towards this terrifying new threat emerging in the East. And this is what ultimately prepares the way for the tycoon.
That is the critical transition. Bayezid had spent decades dealing with external European manipulation, but now a truly existential ideological threat emerged: the Shia Safavid dynasty in Persia, under the very dynamic and charismatic leadership of Shah Ismail.
And Ismail wasn't just a political rival.
No, not at all. He claimed a kind of divine religious legitimacy, and he was actively stirring up dissent among the Turkoman tribes in eastern Anatolia who had Shi'a sympathies.
So this wasn't just a border dispute. This was an internal ideological challenge to the Ottoman claim to be the primary protectors of Sunni Islam.
Exactly, and Bayezid was acutely aware of the gravity of this threat. His later years were dominated by trying to neutralize this Safavid infiltration and prepare Anatolia for the inevitable confrontation. And this shift in focus, from the cautious defense against Europe to this massive mobilization against the East, it sets the ultimate stage for the dramatic, accelerated reign of his son.
And what a reign it was. That brings us to part 3. Selim I, the Thunderbolt Tycoon. If Bayezid's focus was decades of cautious stability, Selim's was 5 years of explosive, world-altering acquisition.
Selim I, often called Selim the Grim, earned his moniker immediately. His accession to the throne in 1512 was the most ruthless adherence yet to his grandfather Mehmed's law's survival.
It was almost a military coup against his own father, wasn't it?
It really was. He forced Bayezid to abdicate, effectively seizing the throne with the backing of the Janissaries. He then systematically executed all of his brothers and numerous nephews, a total, uncompromising adherence to the mandate of fratricide.
It's brutal, but it achieved Mehmed's stated goal.
It did. It secured the monarchy absolutely and cleared the decks for a foreign policy of nothing but aggression and expansion. There would be no Sam Sultan to distract him.
And his focus was laser sharp. He immediately moves to neutralize the threat his father had only managed to contain, the Safavids.
The Safavid challenge was paramount. Shah Ismail was a powerful military leader and a Shia figurehead whose influence threatened to fragment the Ottoman Sunni heartland. Selim's response was swift and definitive, and it all culminated in the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514.
What made that battle so crushing for the Safavids? Was it just numbers, or did technology play the key role?
Technology was the key difference. Ismail relied heavily on his traditional Qizilbash cavalry. These were fierce, swift horsemen, but they were a traditional force. Selim, on the other hand, deployed the fully modernized Ottoman military machine. It was anchored by the Janissary Corps, all armed with muskets and, crucially, massive lines of field artillery.
So it was a complete technological and tactical mismatch.
A total mismatch.
Oh.
When Ismail's cavalry charged, they were just decimated by this organized gunpowder firepower. It was a crushing, demoralizing defeat for Shah Ismail. The immediate consequence was the end of widespread Shia subversive activity within Anatolia and the effective partitioning of the Caucasus. This secured the Ottoman East, stabilized the border, and allowed Selim to turn his attention south.
And here is where the acceleration becomes truly breathtaking. We are moving from stabilizing one border to the conquest of an entire ancient empire, the Mamluk Sultanate, in a matter of months.
The lightning campaign against the Mamluks in 1516 and 1517 is one of the greatest military feats of the early modern period. The Mamluks, based in Egypt, they controlled Syria, Palestine, the Arabian Peninsula. They were strong, but like the Safavids, they relied too heavily on traditional military structures, mainly their elite cavalry forces.
And the Ottomans just hit them with gunpowder technology all over again.
Yes, specifically at 2 decisive battles. First, at Marj-Debik in 1516, which opened the gates to Syria, and then second at Ridania near Cairo in 1517, which broke the Mamluk resistance entirely. The speed of this conquest was just unprecedented. In very short order, the Ottomans acquired Syria, Palestine, and the crown jewel, Egypt.
The acquisition of Egypt is obviously massive in terms of resources, but the ultimate acquisition was spiritual and ideological. This is the moment the tycoon acquires that non-negotiable brand recognition you mentioned, the Caliphate.
This is the historical turning point. By taking Egypt, Selim I secured control over the 2 holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. The Caliphate, The historical succession to the Prophet Muhammad had, for centuries, resided nominally under the Mamluks. It was a kind of shadow caliph, whose authority was mostly symbolic. When Selim conquered Cairo, he officially transferred the caliphate to the House of Osman.
What did that do to the Ottoman Sultan's global status?
It transformed him instantly. He went from being a powerful regional emperor of Padishah to being the supreme, globally dominant Sunni authority. He was now the religious and political leader of the Islamic world. This gave the Ottoman Empire a legitimacy and a spiritual prestige that no other contemporary Islamic state could even begin to rival. It cemented their dominance for centuries.
Let's talk about the practical side of being the tycoon. What did the conquest of Egypt immediately provide the empire? What made Selim the wealthiest and most powerful sultan the Ottomans had yet seen?
The sources just emphasized the sheer concentrated wealth. Egypt was the agricultural breadbasket of the entire region. It was capable of generating massive surplus revenue from grain alone. But even more importantly, the conquest gave the Ottomans direct, undisputed control over the ancient and immensely lucrative spice and gold trade routes that flowed up the Red Sea from India and Africa.
So this sounds like a fundamental economic overhaul that secured the empire's financial future for a long, long time.
That's precisely what it was. This huge injection of wealth subsidized Selim's massive military projects and ensured sustained economic prosperity for the entire empire. We even see the impact on consumer commodities. The sources mention how Cairo benefited, becoming a major hub for the trade of Yemeni coffee, which was rapidly becoming this hugely popular drink across Ottoman cities and the Islamic world.
So 1517 wasn't just a military victory. It was a decisive economic victory that positioned the Ottomans as the masters of global East-West trade. That really puts the whole 64 years into staggering perspective. You go from a state that's recovering from internal strife, focusing on this one regional capital in 1453, to being the undisputed spiritual and economic master of the Islamic world in 1517. It's a remarkable synthesis of military force, political pragmatism, and spiritual acquisition.
It really is. And we can summarize the whole achievement using our analogy one last time. Mehmed II, the architect, he provided the fundamental structure: the unified state, the new capital in Istanbul, the centralized administration in Topkapi, and that necessary ruthless legal framework, the Kanuni.
Then you have Bayezid II, the site manager. He stabilizes those potentially volatile foundations by neutralizing the Sultan crisis, even at great cost, and he integrates valuable human capital, like the Sephardic Jews, to boost the empire's economic and military production, all while securing those crucial maritime routes against the Venetians.
And finally, Selim I, the tycoon, achieves the ultimate corporate takeover. He secures the borders by crushing the Safavids at Chaldiran, and then, in 5 lightning years, he acquires the greatest spiritual legitimacy, the Caliphate, and the immense wealth of Egypt, doubling the empire's power base and ensuring its financial viability for centuries.
By 1517, the Ottoman Empire controls Istanbul, Cairo, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. They are no longer just a Balkan Anatolian power. They're the dominant Sunni authority globally, commanding the most important religious sites in all the major international trade hubs. It's the absolute peak of centralized synthesis.
And the sources that document this period, they often struggle to explain how this incredible pace was maintained, especially when you compare them to their more decentralized, often lineage-obsessed European rivals. And the answer, as we hinted at earlier, lies in that foundational radical structure that Mehmed II built, the Ottoman ruling institution.
This is where the synthesis gets really interesting and maybe the most complex conceptually. We need to clearly delineate this core engine of talent that fueled this incredible rise.
It's vital. You have to understand, the Ottoman state was structurally dualistic. On one hand, you had the Muslim institution. This was the ulema, the scholars, the jurists, the religious establishment. They were the keepers of Sharia law and often had deep local hereditary ties.
And then you had the ruling institution, and this was deliberately created to be separate, loyal only to the Sultan, and ruthlessly meritocratic.
Precisely. Mehmed II formalized this separation. The ruling institution was composed of the men of the sword and the men of the pen, the entire military, administrative, and political apparatus of the state. And crucially, the people who staffed these highest offices, grand viziers, regional governors, army generals, were often deliberately excluded from the traditional Turkish nobility.
So, who staffed it? If not the Turkish elites, then who?
They were the kapıcıları, which means the slaves of the gate. These were individuals who owed their entire existence, their loyalty, and their station to the Sultan and the Sultan alone. They had no external power base. And they were primarily Christian-born slaves.
How were they recruited?
2 main ways. either through the devshirme, which was the periodic levy of young boys from Christian Balkan provinces, or as renegades, who were adult converts who chose to join the system.
And this is the fundamental paradox, isn't it? The most powerful meritocratic government in the contemporary world was built almost entirely upon a foundation of slavery.
The source material is quite explicit about this startling fact. The great offices of the state were usually given to these renegades and tribute boys. The sons of ethnic Turks were traditionally excluded from these top administrative positions, and the logic, from the Sultan's perspective, was simple. A son of a local Turkish noble might have divided loyalties, but a man whose entire life and prestige was gifted to him by the Sultan after being taken from his original family, he was beholden only to the imperial center.
It sounds like an incredibly intense, lifelong training process.
It was far more rigorous than most European education systems of the time. The sources describe it as an almost Platonic system, designed for the selection and training of a ruling elite. These boys and young men were subjected to intensive physical, military, and mental training. They often learned multiple languages, mathematics, theology, governance. The system never asked about your lineage or your background. It studied your potential. It demanded absolute competence.
There's a line from one of the sources, something like, "You shall be a soldier, and if worthy, a general," or "You shall be a scholar and a gentleman, and if the ability lies in you, a governor and a prime minister." The upward mobility must have been immense.
Immense and radical. I mean, compared to contemporary Europe, where power was almost exclusively dictated by aristocratic birth, the Ottoman system was a true meritocracy, even if it was built on this morally ambiguous foundation. The sources state that this system grandly disregarded religious and social prejudices that were so prevalent in other societies. It offered Christian subjects a path to the very top that simply did not exist anywhere else.
And we see the complexity of the reaction to this. Parents sometimes tried to evade the devshirme by quickly marrying off their sons, but other times they seem to have welcomed it.
Many parents, particularly in rural, impoverished areas, knew that entry into the ruling institution meant a guaranteed first-grade education, a salary, and the possibility of a spectacular career that could lift their entire family out of poverty. There were even instances mentioned in the sources where Turkish parents tried to pay Christians to claim their Muslim sons as Christian so they could enter the system. It just highlights the perceived opportunity and the talent magnet this institution became.
And the numbers are staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 2 million of the Christian population were brought into the Ottoman nation over the centuries through this process. This incredible pool of talent, curated ruthlessly for ability rather than bloodline, was the true secret weapon that allowed for the rapid, spectacular imperial synthesis we've been discussing today, led by Mehmed II, the system's architect.
It is the engine of relentless centralized efficiency. It created absolute loyalty, it generated incredible talent, and it removed the perpetual threat of regional aristocratic power bases that could undermine the Sultan's authority.
So we have successfully traced the spectacular results of the system's initial flourish, from the conquest of Istanbul to the acquisition of a caliphate in Egypt in 1517. The Ottomans created the most powerful state in the Islamic world almost overnight, founded on a structure designed for ruthless stability and meritocratic efficiency.
The sheer speed and depth of this transformation truly set the stage for the classical age of the Ottoman Empire that was to follow.
So, we leave you, the learner, with this final provocative thought, building directly on the paradox of the ruling institution and the law of survival. You have seen the foundation, and it's built upon meritocracy through slavery and succession through fratricide. What was the long-term cost, both internally in terms of dynastic morality and externally in terms of perception in the wider world, of building a universal empire upon such a radical and inherently contradictory structure? It worked brilliantly for these 64 years, but how long could such a delicate, ruthless synthesis last before the costs began to outweigh the benefits? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.